This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. Okay, this is the second time that we're going to be talking about questions of social reproduction, and I'm very happy to have my good friend Cindi Katz back to talk about this. Cindi is a geographer at CUNY Graduate Center, where I also teach. So we've known each other for many years, in part because we're both geographers, which is a little bit unusual. But the question of social reproduction, I think there is a critical arena of really of struggle. When we start to look at the stresses which are felt by households, and a lot of that stress, of course, historically and to this day, has involved a gender disparity. And I think that maybe we should talk a little bit about the gender disparity and what that does, and some of the issues that have arisen in Marxist theory about that, because as you know, you've been trying to educate me into a better understanding of these questions for some time. And
how am I doing?
You're doing very well, but as you always say, maybe one day I'll get it,
I do say that.
Yes.
Because I'm a hopeful person,
Yes.
but I've also been beating my head against a wall for a while. It's a gendered question because of the way domestic labor has been structured for a very long time, and how capitalism and capitalists have taken advantage of that gender division of labor, but also how that gender division benefits men in many ways. And so there's different scales in which the struggles over social reproduction happen. And I think it's important to recognize how much labor goes into something that I've called the messy, fleshy stuff of everyday life. But how do you have biological reproduction, the kind of daily grind of reproduction, get clothing, food, all the stuff that goes into getting food on the table, a child ready for school, a person ready to go to work, including the person who may be doing more of that labor. So under current conditions, many times it's a dual earner household if there are two parents present, if there are children. But let's take the kind of heteronormative nuclear family for now, to say that all of that labor that goes into making a working population is done in large measure within the household, and in large measure there's a kind of uneven gender division of labor. Yeah. And there's a misrecognition of how much of that labor is a subsidy to capital, and in certain ways a subsidy to, in a heteronormative way, men. But that recognition is hard won. And so I was going to say something else, but I'll go in this direction. But that division of labor enables accumulation and is something that has led to feminist struggles around domestic labor. There in the 70s, and this is well known about social reproduction, there was the wages for housework movement. So how do you recognize this work? By paying for it, by monetizing it, and who would pay? And so obviously under capitalism, there is the family wage, which is understood to support this labor that takes place in the household, but in no way covers all of that labor. So monetizing and with wages for housework was a way of saying this labor can be accounted for, and this labor should be accounted for and paid in recognition for how much is being kind of subsidizing how surplus value is extracted. And I'll leave it to you to talk about how surplus value is extracted. Yeah. But that is a huge subsidy, and including within the household, but also, as I was saying in the last session, the global flows of migration of domestic labor, people who come and work in a household, cleaning, cooking, taking care of children, are also subsidizing that accumulation.
Yeah, and if you take a lot of what might be called the care industries in some ways, a lot of this is actually populated by migrant groups. I mean, Philippine women being sent all around the world. It's almost an export trade of the Philippines to do that. So it seems that there is a whole economy here which operates on a different level with different implications. And that economy is also divided by class in lots of ways. I mean, what happens in terms of social reproduction and the upper classes, and we have all sorts of issues arising there about education and access to education, public education versus private education, and in many ways the replication of the class system actually occurs within the household and within the different structures of social reproduction.
And those different structures include housing, education, public education, formal education, healthcare, and how that's understood to be part of sustaining a social formation and who's responsible for sustaining it. And in terms of the sort of labor migration for domestic labor, but also for care work in caring for elderly, caring for children, caring for ill people, is also so much of a kind of export of people from largely the global South who send remittances home, which sustains their households, but is small compared to what it would take if their households were with them in the U.S. or in Europe or Canada, so that there's a kind of offloading of the costs translocally, but globally. And if those countries did not send all these people to do care work or to work in the tech industries, Silicon Valley is making a fortune off of South Asian people who are educated in South Asia who come and do work, and elsewhere, whose education is paid for elsewhere and is not compensated. And so you can think of it there as like the brain drain, but it's like a movement of subsidized care and labor, and says to me there's all kinds of organizing that should be done around those issues of social reproduction.
And it connects, I think, for instance, many Mexican migrant workers working in the fields, they may, work here and be part of the labor force, but if they get sick from exposure to pesticides, then basically they get sent back to Mexico and have to get cared for there. So that in a sense, this whole kind of question of how the domestic economies are organized and what role they're playing within this overall dynamic of capital accumulation, this is becoming a very important question.
Yeah, and the kind of undocumented workers who then have no rights to Social Security, to health care, or to the workers' compensation or anything when these industrial accidents or pesticide exposure happens.
Now, I just wonder about this, though, that in recent years, over the last 5-10 years, there's been an explosion of work on social reproduction and so on. And I wonder if you had any sort of explanation as to why this is becoming so popular now.
I've been kind of amazed and thrilled / horrified since I'm trying to put together a book of many of my writings on social reproduction. It feels like, oh no, every minute somebody's doing something, but it's kind of great. I think it may have to do with the level at which these issues that we're talking about are in crisis and are the arena in which the crisis of neoliberal capitalism is felt and lived and calls for thinking of a new way out of this. I mean, I said earlier on, and I've been saying for 40 years, the shop floor is not the only site of organizing. Right. And I think the limits to that, although there's been some good successes in workplace struggles recently, is that this is not enough, that we really need to not just make the connections, as I've suggested with my counter topographies, among sites, but make connections across different parts of labor. And so to see the questions of care as questions in which we are in crisis, and to see education and the privatization. I mean, the assault of neoliberalism is so profound, and it's now been 40 years of that assault, that it feels like people are saying, how can we deal with this? It is experienced around all of these issues we're talking about. And maybe added to that is the aging population, in which care work, and we're all living longer and longer and needing more and more more and more aspects of what social reproduction is about. And that the privatization and devolution of what constitutes social reproduction is no longer able to be borne by people. People who are excessed from viable futures cannot sustain survival, really. So it seems to me that part of this must be about how do you think about a survivable future, to say nothing about a thrivable one, without thinking about these concerns.
Well, one of the things I think that we can observe about the impact of neoliberal policies and politics, along with the sort of deindustrialization and a lot of the forms of technological change which have entered in, is that this has actually divided people. The questions and structures of solidarities have been dismantled. A lot of the institutions that used to be the center of activism have been undermined. And I think, for me, I would kind of say, well, this produces a great deal of alienation around the question of daily life. And one of the things I think is so interesting about your own work is the way in which you connect social reproduction with what might be called the critique of everyday life. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a tremendous dissatisfaction with the qualities of everyday life right now. So it's not only dissatisfaction with the job structures, which become increasingly meaningless, but there's a daily life there which is stressful, and to the degree you're engaging with it, it's lacking really human contact and all the rest of it. And it seems to me that this is what makes social reproduction so critical to an anti-capitalist politics, because an alternative to that has to be constructed, and that therefore working on that question seems to me to be one of the critical areas of engagement and politics.
I've succeeded.
You've succeeded in training me.
Finally.
Yeah.
I definitely agree completely, and I do think the way people, the thing that has always drawn me to social reproduction, but also to everyday life as a critical practice, is the idea, because we are in such a mess, and that mess we could say it's 500 years in the making, but it's quite differently experienced in the last few decades, that to think that we make these conditions in our everyday practices, and this is a bit utopian, but I think we need to have a sense of hope that one of the things that Lefebvre's taught us is that everyday life is a critical practice.
Right.
That in understanding that we make these conditions, that we make these workers or people, that we make these institutional frameworks that are racist, exploitative, alienating, we can become conscious of that process and those material social practices and make them different. And that allows for a kind of solidarity around these everyday practices, that when people see we have social housing is in disarray in this country. And when people feel like the ways affordable housing is being produced is completely unaffordable, for one, but also that the conditions in public housing are such that people are so alienated and treated as if they are, incarcerated.
Right.
That there's need for solidarity and organizing around those settings. In those settings, that when you have crappy playgrounds in poor neighborhoods, there's something to organize around. That if everybody bails from a public education system and goes off in their privatized ways to secure the future for their child and neglect the rest, that we're lost. And so organizing around education and then seeing, the grander scheme is to say this playground and organizing around that, or organizing around housing, is connected to the larger questions of social reproduction, that here are struggles that we can work at different scales.
Right.
But that I might be working on the common grounds of education, and you might be working on the common grounds of housing, and then there's a larger frame in which we have to work and understand that we're making these conditions and really should be organizing around them to make them differently.
And I think one of the things, again, I sort of is impressive about your own approach to this is the way in which you connect this to the environmental questions, because it's not only about making an everyday life in the ordinary kind of sense, it's also about making environmental conditions and what those environmental conditions are about. So there is a connectivity that flows, if you like, from the social reproduction to the everyday life to the kind of question of the qualities of the environment. Totally.
I feel like as a geographer who works on social reproduction, one of the things I've tried to emphasize is what, calling it the grounds of social reproduction. And in Marx, there's the idea of reproducing the forces of production as well as the social relations of production. The forces of production are not just the factories and the machinery, but the environments. And if we desecrate one environment after another, or deforest here and destroy coal fields there, that destroys the reproduction of capital accumulation, but it also creates unhealthy environments and unsurvivable places, and needs to migrate away, or to be kind of in places that there are all too many of that have been disinvested completely. But I think looking at the grounds and the environments, and I've looked at this around Katrina in New Orleans and thought about how that the way this storm affected an already disinvested arena of social reproduction was around these very issues about flood control and the erosion and the sea level rise, all of the issues about the environment, but also in Sudan, looking at deforestation. So I think it's a way to connect environmental justice movements to social reproduction movements around social reproduction. And I think that that's not commonly seen. There's sort of domestic labor questions and the workforce relations. And I want to include in anyone's understanding of social reproduction that environmental aspect, because as the environment is destroyed or made uninhabitable in various ways, the survival and the basic questions of social reproduction are undermined.
I think from the left standpoint, I mean, there's always this problem of segregation of effort on the left, the tendency to sort of each group to be in its silo. So there's a group on education, and there's a group on environment, and there's a group on something else. And it does seem to me that exploring these connections and these connectivities, which are not hard to do, to sort of say, well, you know, an environmental justice movement is about qualities of life in particular communities, and it's going to take community solidarities to confront and deal with those issues. And while you're at it, why don't you reform the educational system as well? You know, in other words, why not move that in that kind of way?
Yeah, no, and I think social reproduction is a way to make that visible, make those connections in terms of how life is lived every day in different historical geographies, at different scales, and how do we make those conditions better? And
it is interesting. I mean, you know, with my interest in urbanization, I kind of look at all of the urban struggles that have occurred around the world, and you know, you could just look this last week, what's happened in Santiago and Chile. Everything's erupted. Week before that, in Ecuador, there was a kind of an eruption. Beirut has gone crazy. Baghdad has gone crazy. In other words, all of these places. Yes, yeah. So it looks. I mean, I have this kind of fantasy that maybe from outer space we might have a map of planet Earth, and all the lights would go on, showing where the struggle's going on.
That's good.
And you'd see the whole world in turmoil. And then you say, well, why isn't it all connected in some way to do something very different? And we've seen some. I think just this last year in this country, the teachers' strikes seemed to me to be very, very, and it wasn't just simply about my salary. It was about, you know, the inferior qualities of the education which the teachers were able to deliver, because they don't have the resources and they don't have the assets and they don't have what is really needed for adequate purposes of social reproduction. And then we had the Chicago teachers out on strike. So there is, if you like, movement going on in this area. And I think, you know, pulling it all together, it seems to me to be is a fantastic kind of a part of what anti-capitalist politics has to be about.
Definitely. And that is an endless ongoing struggle, because I think the stronger we are in our anti-capitalism, the greater the potential for the sort of suppression and backlash. And yet there's so many places where these things are happening that it's important to keep seeing that and mobilizing around that and connecting it. And the kinds of things I've laid out as connections, and that you obviously have done all for years, is crucial. But it's like making that thing that capital works so hard to make invisible, or to extinguish, so you don't have that view of what I'm thinking of as contour lines.
Well, I think
But I think some movements really do work around those places, like Via Campesina, who connect different sites and different aspects of agricultural production, and could connect further to food justice movements. And there you'd have the urban and rural working together.
And I think some of the things that are happening suggest that political power, whoever they are, is made very nervous by the connectivities, so that there is, if you like, a strategic tendency of political power to try to keep things in their silos and make sure we don't come out and say, hey, what's going on in all these other areas?
Yeah. No, and that's what the part of our work is, to not let that siloing and making invisible the different struggles is crucial.
Yeah.
But
well, we can actually, I think, conclude this right now, and maybe we'll have you back again and we can talk further about many of these issues, because I think this is what anti-capitalist struggle should be embracing these days.
Thank you. And one of the things that this project I'm working on now is how that, which should be an anti-capitalist struggle, is often responded to under neoliberalism as something to manage rather than to oppose. And so looking at childhood now as a kind of management strategy rather than an opposite, something that says, no, we have to work in a very different way.
Right.
And that way is anti-capitalist.
So thank you, Cindi. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production. A special thank you to the wonderful Patreon community for supporting this project.